The screaming never stops in Commorragh, but you learn to distinguish types, to categorize the endless symphony of agony that echoes through the twisted spires and labyrinthine corridors of the dark city. There's the fresh screaming, high-pitched, disbelieving, still clinging to hope that this is nightmare rather than reality. There's the seasoned, screaming lower, more controlled, the sound of someone who's learned to ration their voice because the Drukhari reward spectacular suffering with longer life and silence, with creative cruelties designed to extract sound. And there's the broken screaming, barely human anymore, the vocal cords shredded, the mind fractured, producing noises that bypass language entirely and communicate pure animal distress. I've progressed through all three categories during my time here, though time is a concept that dissolves under the Dark City's impossible architecture and the Drukhari's casual mastery over perception and duration. I was Lieutenant Kalen Voss of the Astra Militarum, Cadian trained, survivor of 6 campaigns across the Segmentum Obscurus, and I'd believed that nothing could break a soldier who'd faced orcs and chaos cultists and held the line when lesser men fled. I was wrong. I was so catastrophically, fundamentally wrong that the memory of my confidence tastes like ashes and mockery. We were on a frontier world designated Xerxes Tertius, reinforcing the PDF garrison against raiders who'd been hitting supply convoys and disappearing into the wilderness. Command classified them as pirates or renegades, possibly chaos-tainted, but not organized enough to warrant full Imperial attention. We should have known better. The Imperium's intelligence apparatus is vast, but its understanding of Xenos threats remains dangerously incomplete, filtered through religious dogma and bureaucratic inertia until actionable information becomes useless generalities. The raids had been surgical, precise, taking specific individuals rather than massacring entire populations. That should have been the warning: the Drukhari don't kill when they can capture, don't destroy when they can harvest, because their society runs on suffering the way ours runs on faith and firepower. But we didn't recognize the pattern, didn't understand what we were facing until the night they came for the garrison with overwhelming force and contemptuous ease. They hit us 3 hours before dawn, materializing from Webway portals that tore reality like wounds, spilling forth in a tide of impossible speed and casual cruelty. I'd fought fast enemies before Elder Corsairs move with inhuman grace, but the Drukhari were something else entirely, their movements less combat and more performance art, killing not from necessity but from aesthetic pleasure in perfectly executed violence. They wore armor that looked like flayed skin and bladed silk, carried weapons that removed flesh in ways that violated geometry, and their faces behind Baroque masks showed expressions of bored amusement as they butchered men who'd survived years of warfare. We tried to fight. Emperor knows we tried, but they weren't interested in battle, only in harvest. And within 20 minutes, the garrison was subdued. Those who died quickly counted as fortunate, those who survived marked for export to Commorragh's slave markets and torture galleries. I woke in a cage, one of hundreds stacked in a hold that defied spatial logic, the dimensions wrong in ways that made my eyes hurt and my stomach clench. The smell hit me immediately, not just unwashed bodies and fear sweat, but something else, something organic and wrong, as if the ship itself was partially alive and exuding metabolic byproducts through its walls. My fellow prisoners were a mixture of humans from various worlds, all military or PDF, all captured for reasons I didn't yet understand. A woman next to me, I never learned her name, was weeping quietly, not from pain but from the dawning realization that death wasn't coming to end this, that we'd been taken for purposes worse than execution. An older sergeant with Cadian tattoos similar to mine was praying, reciting the litany of protection in a steady monotone that suggested he was using prayer as anchor against encroaching madness. I joined him because it gave my mind something to focus on besides the smell and the wrongness of the ship's geometry and the distant sounds of screaming from other parts of the hold. The journey lasted days or hours or weeks. Duration became slippery aboard the raider, time stretching and compressing according to principles I couldn't grasp. They fed us occasionally, thin gruel that tasted of metal and decay, dispensed by hunched slave creatures that might have been human once, but had been modified so extensively that species identification became guesswork. They watered us irregularly, keeping us dehydrated enough to be weak but functional. And periodically, Drukhari would enter the hold and select prisoners at random, dragging them away to destinations that produced the screaming we all learned to dread. Some came back, most didn't. Those who returned were changed, not always visibly, but in their eyes, in the way they moved, in the careful blankness of their expressions that suggested they'd witnessed or experienced things their minds couldn't process without fragmenting. No one spoke about what happened during these selections. Speaking would have required acknowledging reality, and reality had become something we were all desperately trying to avoid. We arrived in Commorragh with a sensation like falling through broken glass, the ship's transition from realspace to Webway to Dark City, producing a disorientation so profound, several prisoners vomited or lost consciousness. The cages were opened by slave things wearing shock collars and wielding prod weapons that delivered pain through touch, herding us out onto platforms overlooking a cityscape that shouldn't have been possible. Commorragh stretched in every direction, towers and spires and structures that violated Euclidean geometry, lit by stolen suns and strange luminescence that cast shadows in colors that hurt to perceive. The sky, if that word applied to whatever arched overhead, was purple-black and filled with flying vehicles that moved between the spires like predatory insects. And the smell intensified, that organic wrongness mixing with incense and chemicals and the accumulated stench of a city built on suffering and sustained by harvested agony. They sorted us on the platforms, Drukhari overseers examining prisoners with the clinical detachment of livestock merchants, checking teeth and muscle tone and flexibility, marking some for immediate sale and others for specialty markets. I was classified as military grade, suitable for arena combat or guard service or torture demonstration, whatever category commanded premium prices in Commorragh's economy. The older sergeant was taken separately, marked for something the Drukhari called artistic purposes in their musical, mocking Gothic. The woman who'd been weeping was purchased by a representative of what I later learned was a homunculus coven, taken away to be transformed into something useful to beings who'd mastered flesh sculpting and pain amplification as combined art form and science. I was sold to a pleasure cult, though pleasure in Commorragh means something far removed from any human understanding of the term. Their entertainments derived entirely from the suffering of others and refined through millennia of dedicated cruelty. The cult's facility was a sprawling complex carved into one of the Dark City's mid-level spires, its architecture deliberately designed to disorient and disturb with corridors that seemed to shift configuration when I wasn't looking directly at them, rooms whose proportions created subtle wrongness that made extended occupation psychologically taxing, and lighting that fluctuated through colors no human eye was meant to process. My fellow slaves numbered in the hundreds, humans from dozens of worlds mixed with specimens from xenospecies I didn't recognize, all kept in holding cells when not being used for whatever purposes the cult required. The cells were minimally furnished, sleeping platforms, waste facilities, feeding troughs, but maintained at standards that suggested the Drukhari wanted us healthy enough to suffer optimally rather than merely survive. The work began my second day in Commorragh. Though day is meaningless in a city whose time flows according to the whims of beings who've achieved functional immortality through torture and soul drinking, I was taken from my cell by guards wearing armor that looked like crystallized shadows and led through corridors where the walls sometimes showed disturbing frescoes and sometimes seemed to be observing us, to a chamber filled with equipment whose purposes I initially couldn't identify. A Drukhari female siren. She eventually told me her name was Siren, though names among the Dark Eldar carry layers of meaning and threat, explained through a translation collar locked around my neck that I would be serving as subject in pain response, demonstrations for the cult's paying guests. The Drukhari, she continued in that musical mocking tone they all shared, had perfected suffering as art form, had explored every possible variation of physical and psychological torment across spans of time that made human history seem brief as mayfly life. And I, fresh from the crude violence of imperial warfare, would provide entertainment through my naive reactions to their refined cruelties. The first session involved tools I recognized: blades, heated implements, devices clearly designed for causing controlled damage. Siren worked with the precision of a surgeon and the detachment of a technician, explaining to her audience each cut's purpose, each burn's effect, demonstrating techniques developed over millennia for maximizing pain while minimizing actual injury. She kept me conscious through chemical injections, prevented shock through others, amplified nerve sensitivity through yet more, transforming my body into an instrument that existed purely to transmit suffering. And I screamed, of course I screamed, adding my voice to Commorragh's endless symphony, while Drukhari spectators watched with expressions of aesthetic appreciation, discussing my responses the way human art critics might debate a painting's composition. The sessions continued with escalating sophistication. They introduced drugs that made time dilate, stretching seconds of torture into subjective hours. They employed devices that stimulated pain receptors directly, creating suffering without corresponding physical damage, letting them torture the same tissue repeatedly without wearing it out. They used psychic amplifiers that made me experience phantom sensations, burning when there was no fire, cutting when no blade touched me, drowning when I was breathing normally. And through it all, Siren maintained her clinical commentary, educating her audience about human neurological responses, demonstrating how we differed from other species in our capacity for suffering, proving through my continued consciousness that humans could endure far more than we typically believed possible. Between sessions, I was returned to my cell, given medical treatment that repaired damage and prepared me for the next demonstration, fed and watered and maintained as one maintains any valuable tool. My fellow slaves rarely spoke. Communication discouraged through punishment, but also through the simple fact that we had nothing to say to each other. What comfort could we offer? What hope could we share? We were property in a society that had perfected suffering across subjective eternities, kept alive specifically because death would end our utility. I tried praying initially, reciting catechisms and litanies, invoking the Emperor's protection and mercy, but the words felt hollow in Commorragh's twisted architecture, and eventually I stopped because prayer required hope, and hope had become too painful to maintain. The smell evolved as my time extended, or perhaps my perception of it changed as I adapted to Commorragh's environment. The organic wrongness I'd noticed aboard the raider ship was everywhere in the Dark City, emanating from the architecture itself, from the very air, as if the entire place was constructed from materials that had once been alive, or still were in ways that violated biological principles. It mixed with incense the Drukhari burned not for religious purposes. They'd abandoned gods long ago, but for aesthetic reasons. Complex fragrances designed to enhance suffering or mark particular occasions. And underneath everything was the smell of fear, sweat, and pain chemicals, the accumulated scent of countless victims whose suffering had literally soaked into Commorragh's foundations across 10,000 years of continuous operation. Siren developed what she called professional interest in me, fascinated by how long I maintained psychological coherence despite the torture. Most humans fragmented quickly, she explained, their minds breaking down after relatively brief periods of optimal suffering. But military training, particularly Cadian military training, had instilled discipline that proved unexpectedly durable, my consciousness remaining intact through sessions that should have reduced me to gibbering wreckage. This made me valuable, she continued, because the Drukhari prized quality of suffering over mere quantity, appreciated subjects who could experience their full artistry rather than breaking immediately into mindless screaming. I was being preserved, she assured me, maintained as a showcase piece that demonstrated her cult's technical sophistication. The preservation involved extensive physical modification. They implanted devices that regulated my nervous system, preventing the merciful numbness that extended torture usually produces. They modified my pain receptors, making them more sensitive while simultaneously making them more durable. They adjusted my metabolism, letting me survive extended periods without sleep or proper nutrition, keeping me conscious and aware through conditions that should have caused unconsciousness or death. And they did something to my perception of time, some alteration that made seconds stretch into minutes, minutes into hours, so that brief torture sessions became subjective eternities of suffering. I was being transformed, bit by bit, into an optimal victim, my body re-engineered specifically to experience and transmit the maximum possible suffering while maintaining the consciousness to appreciate every moment of it. I lost track of duration as the sessions continued and compounded. Days or weeks or months or years, time had become functionally meaningless when each second could be stretched into hours of subjective agony. My body showed signs of extended captivity. I was thinner despite regular feeding, my muscles maintaining tone through forced exercise regimens, but my flesh developing the stretched quality of someone whose biology was being artificially sustained beyond normal parameters. My face in the polished surfaces that served as mirrors throughout the facility showed hollow eyes and an expression of permanent exhaustion, someone who'd seen too much and endured too long and had nothing left except the stubborn refusal to completely break that Siren found so professionally fascinating. The other slaves changed around me, new arrivals replacing those who'd been used up or sold or transformed beyond recognition. I watched fresh prisoners arrive with the same disbelief and dawning horror I'd experienced, watched them progress through the same stages of accommodation and despair, watched them break or adapt or transform. Some were taken by homunculus covens and returned as grotesques, massively augmented combat creatures that retained just enough consciousness to understand what they'd become. Others were sold to arena fighting pits, given weapons and forced to battle for Drukhari entertainment, surviving only as long as they could kill whatever was set against them. Still others simply disappeared into Commorragh's depths, absorbed into the Dark City's vast infrastructure of suffering in ways I couldn't track or understand. Siren introduced variation to her demonstrations as time extended, experimenting with new techniques and technologies, pushing boundaries of what human physiology could withstand. She began incorporating psychic elements, hiring mandrakes, shadow creatures from Commorragh's darkest regions, to induce terror responses that transcended mere physical torture. She experimented with temporal distortion, extending my subjective experience of torture sessions far beyond their objective duration, creating situations where I experienced days or weeks of suffering compressed into actual hours. She introduced competitive elements, having multiple subjects tortured simultaneously and judging which produced the most aesthetically satisfying suffering. And through it all she maintained her clinical commentary, treating my agony as data points in ongoing research into optimal pain production. The smell had become part of me by then, or I'd become part of it. The distinction had blurred beyond meaningful separation. I smelled of Commorragh's organic wrongness and fear chemicals, and the strange incense the Drukhari favored, carrying the Dark City's scent in my skin and hair, and the very essence of my being. When I breathed, I tasted it. When I moved, I felt it clinging to me like oil. When I slept, those rare periods when unconsciousness was permitted, I dreamed in olfactory hallucinations of rot and perfume and terror. The smell had become my identity marker, the sensory signature that defined my existence as Drukhari property, as livestock maintained for specialized purpose, as a thing that had once been human but had been transformed through extended suffering into something else. I met a servitor once, or what had been a servitor before the Drukhari purchased it from some corrupt tech priest and began extensive modifications. It could still speak, barely, through Vox grill that had been integrated into its extensively rebuilt throat, and during a brief period when we were stored in adjacent cells, it told me that it had been human once, a criminal sentenced to servitor conversion, believing that was the worst fate possible. It laughed at this memory, a horrible mechanical sound, explaining that imperial servitor conversion was mercy compared to what the Drukhari did, that the Adeptus Mechanicus lobotomized their subjects partially out of technical necessity, but also out of kindness, that the Drukhari kept consciousness intact, specifically to ensure their victims could fully appreciate their transformation. The servitor thing had been with the Drukhari for subjective decades, it claimed, rebuilt and modified and used for purposes it wouldn't or couldn't articulate, and it told me with something approaching pity that I would eventually join it in the category of things that used to be human, that resistance only prolonged the inevitable, that acceptance would come eventually, or I would simply be broken down and rebuilt until acceptance was no longer optional. I tried to escape once, during a transport between facilities, managed to slip my restraints and run through Commorragh's labyrinthine passages with desperate, futile speed. The Drukhari let me run for what felt like hours, probably finding entertainment in my attempt, before recapturing me with casual efficiency. The punishment was instructive. Siren spent what she claimed was 3 weeks demonstrating advanced torture techniques to an advanced audience, time dilated so that the objective duration was measured in days, but my subjective experience stretched into what felt like months. She explained throughout that escape attempts were common among new acquisitions but rare among experienced property, that the futility became obvious eventually, that Commorragh's architecture itself was designed to trap and confuse. that the Dark City had existed for 10,000 years, specifically as a prison whose inmates never realized they were imprisoned, because there was nowhere beyond the prison walls, no outside, no escape possible even in theory. And when she'd finished demonstrating this lesson, she had me returned to my cell with modifications that made future escape attempts physically impossible, my body reconfigured so that extended movement beyond permitted ranges produced automatic pain signals that prevented running or even rapid walking. The smell took on new dimensions after the failed escape, or perhaps I'd simply developed greater sensitivity to its variations. I could smell fear on new prisoners before they'd even left their cells, could smell the different chemical signatures of terror versus pain versus despair. I could smell the Drukhari themselves, their scent carrying notes of something alien and ancient, predatory in ways that transcended mere biology. I could smell Commorragh's architecture, the organic components that had been integrated into its construction releasing metabolic byproducts that created the wrongness I'd noticed from the beginning. And I could smell time impossible to explain but undeniable, different durations carrying different olfactory signatures, letting me distinguish between objective and subjective temporal passage through scent alone. Siren began using me for specialized demonstrations that required extended consciousness and reliable responses, renting me out to other pleasure cults and Haemonculi who wanted to showcase particular techniques or test experimental procedures. I was transported through Commorragh's depths to facilities that made Siren's operation seem restrained, witnessed tortures that transcended physical suffering entirely, and entered territories of psychological and spiritual violation. I saw humans transformed into furniture, their bodies reshaped, but consciousness maintained so they could experience their new existence as objects. I saw entire menageries of modified victims, each one representing some homunculus's artistic vision or technical achievement. I saw arena combat where the fighters were kept technically alive even after sustaining lethal damage, forced to continue fighting as walking corpses through Drukhari biotechnology. And through it all the smell intensified, became overwhelming, became my entire sensory existence until I was navigating the Dark City purely through olfactory information because vision and sound had become too painful to process reliably. I realized at some point that I'd stopped thinking of myself as human, had begun identifying as property, as a specialized tool maintained for particular purposes, as something that resembled humanity superficially but had been fundamentally altered through modification and conditioning. This was adaptation, I understood. The mind's survival mechanism protecting itself through dissociation and identity dissolution. But understanding the process didn't stop it, couldn't prevent the slow erosion of self until Kalen Voss, the Cadian lieutenant, was just a memory, increasingly distant and unreal, while the present was a thing that existed to suffer optimally for Drukhari entertainment. The transition happened gradually rather than suddenly, my consciousness fragmenting into before and after categories, the before fading as the after stretched on and dominated. Siren noticed the change, commented on it during a demonstration, explaining to her audience that this was expected developmental trajectory for military subjects. The discipline that initially made us valuable eventually became the foundation for complete psychological reconstruction, the same training that let us endure extended suffering, also making us more susceptible to deep conditioning because we were already trained to subordinate individual desire to externally imposed authority structures. I was becoming an ideal subject, she continued, my consciousness maintaining coherence while simultaneously accepting complete subservience to Drukhari purposes, my suffering perfected through transformation from involuntary reaction to voluntary offering. And she was right, horrifyingly right. I'd begun experiencing something approaching pride when demonstrations went well, when my responses satisfied the audience, when Siren commented positively on my performance. I was seeking approval from my torturers, had internalized their values and goals, had become complicit in my own suffering. The smell had evolved beyond mere sensation by then, become a form of communication, a language I could read more fluently than Gothic or Low Gothic. I could smell Siren's moods, anticipate her intentions through subtle olfactory cues. I could smell the audience's reactions during demonstrations, knew when my suffering was producing desired aesthetic responses through their chemical signatures. I could smell my fellow slaves' conditions, identify who was breaking and who was adapting and who was being prepared for modification or sale. The smell had become my primary sense, more reliable than vision in Commorragh's deliberately disorienting architecture, more informative than hearing among beings who communicated as much through inflection and implication as through words. I was becoming specialized, adapted, transformed into something that could function efficiently in an environment designed to break human consciousness. They introduced me to the concept of pain addiction through chemical interventions and conditioning, explaining that extended suffering produced neurological changes that eventually made agony necessary for normal function. The modifications they'd performed on my nervous system had created dependencies, my brain requiring pain stimulus to produce the neurotransmitters necessary for consciousness and awareness. Without regular torture, I experienced withdrawal symptoms that were themselves agonizing, created suffering loops where absence of pain produced pain that only pain could alleviate. I'd been transformed into a being whose only relief came through continued suffering, whose biochemistry demanded torture the way normal humans demanded food and water, who literally couldn't function without the very thing that was destroying me. This was ultimate refinement of Drukhari cruelty, not just causing suffering but making suffering necessary, transformation suffering from something inflicted to something required. Time had lost all meaning by then, existing only as continuous present of suffering and anticipation of suffering, my past life as imperial soldier increasingly unreal and irrelevant. The smell was everything, communication and identity and environment, all compressed into olfactory experience that dominated consciousness. I could smell the future sometimes, or thought I could precognitive whiffs of upcoming sessions, advance warning of what Siren was planning, foreknowledge of pain encoded in chemical signatures I'd learned to interpret through extended exposure. Whether this was actual psychic sensitivity or simply pattern recognition developed through desperate need to anticipate and prepare didn't matter. The result was the same existence as continuous anticipation of suffering, every moment pregnant with the promise of agony, relief impossible because relief meant withdrawal, which meant different agony. I witnessed other slaves break completely, their consciousness fragmenting beyond recovery, becoming things that resembled humans only superficially, while their minds had retreated into catatonic shutdown or fragmented into psychosis that prevented coherent awareness. The Drukhari had uses for these broken specimens too, transforming them into products that required no consciousness organ banks, raw materials for Haemonculus, flesh sculpting, combat servitors who needed no awareness to follow simple commands. Nothing was wasted in Commorragh, every component of every victim utilized optimally, the Dark City's economy running on suffering extracted with maximum efficiency across subjective eternities. And I was terrified of joining them, of crossing that final threshold where even conditioned consciousness couldn't maintain coherence, becoming one of the empty things that shambled through the holding cells waiting for final processing. Siren assured me this wouldn't happen, that I'd proven too valuable for simple breakdown, that I was being preserved as showcase piece demonstrating her cult's technical achievement. She'd invested too much in my conditioning and modification to waste the investment, had created in me something approaching a masterpiece of sustained, optimal suffering. I would continue indefinitely, she promised, maintained at the perfect threshold where consciousness remained intact while experiencing maximum pain, never breaking completely but never recovering either, existing in eternal liminal state between human and object. This was supposed to be reassurance but functioned as new horror immortality through suffering, existence extended purely for the purpose of continued torture, life without any possibility of death or escape, or even the merciful oblivion of complete psychological breakdown. The smell had become identity by then, was inseparable from consciousness itself, until I couldn't distinguish between what I smelled and what I was. The organic wrongness was my essence. The fear chemicals were my substance. The Drukhari incense was my spirit. I'd transcended individual existence, had become pure sensory experience, awareness that existed only to process suffering through olfactory channels. My body was irrelevant mechanism for producing the chemical signatures I'd learned to read and interpret and predict. My mind was just processing system for translating pain into smell, into more pain, into more smell, into infinite recursive loop. And yet some core fragment remained, some irreducible element that still remembered being Kalen Voss, Cadian lieutenant, human being with identity and agency and hope. This fragment was tiny, barely noticeable beneath the conditioning and modification and pain addiction, but it persisted despite everything, stubborn and futile, and ultimately meaningless. It whispered sometimes during the rare periods between sessions, reminded me that I'd been human once, that I'd believed in the Emperor and the Imperium and humanity's essential dignity. But these whispers felt like racial memory, like genetic information rather than personal history, echoes of someone who'd existed but wasn't me anymore because I was Siren's property, Siren's achievement, Siren's masterpiece of suffering made flesh. The demonstrations continued without variation or mercy, each one precisely calibrated to maintain me at optimal levels of consciousness and suffering, never allowing adaptation or recovery, keeping me suspended in eternal present of perfectly refined agony. The audiences came and went, Drukhari from various castes and cults, all appreciating the sophistication of what Siren had achieved through my transformation. And I performed, because performance was all that remained. Existence reduced to producing suffering that satisfied aesthetic criteria I'd internalized completely. The smell was everything and I was the smell, and the smell was Commorragh, and Commorragh was eternity, and eternity was pain, and pain was existence, and existence was smell, circular and complete and perfectly horrifying. I understand now why they keep us, why they maintain this vast infrastructure of suffering rather than simply killing and moving on. Death is easy, requires no sophistication or technical achievement, produces only brief fear before the mercy of oblivion. But transformation, gradual, methodical, complete transformation of consciousness from resistance to acceptance, from human to object, from individual to property, this requires skill and patience and technological sophistication that proves Drukhari superiority, not through violence, but through artistry. We are their proof of concept, demonstrations that consciousness itself is malleable, that even the most resistant can be broken and rebuilt, that suffering can be refined into pure aesthetic experience appreciated by observers who've spent millennia perfecting cruelty as combined science and art form. The smell continues, will always continue, is eternal as Commorragh itself, and just as inescapable. I breathe it, I taste it, I am it, existing as pure olfactory experience in a body, maintained artificially, and a mind conditioned thoroughly, and a soul that may or may not still exist, depending on whether souls can survive the kinds of transformation I've undergone. The Emperor doesn't protect, not here, not in depths beyond the Imperium's reach, where suffering is currency and consciousness is commodity, and humanity is just another resource to be harvested and processed and utilized optimally. This is what it's like to be a prisoner of the Drukhari, not death but transformation, not ending but continuation, not mercy but the absolute absence of mercy refined across subjective eternities by beings who've forgotten everything except how to inflict and appreciate suffering. This is the smell of extinction that doesn't end, consciousness that continues past any reasonable endpoint, existence that serves no purpose, except demonstrating that existence can be made meaningless while remaining exquisitely, horrifyingly aware. I was Kalen Voss once. Now I am the smell. And the smell is eternal.